The morning light filtered through the towering windows of the Blackwell mansion on the Upper East Side, casting long shadows across marble floors that Elena Rodriguez had been polishing since 5 in the morning. Her calloused hands moved methodically across the surface, the same way they had every day for the past 3 years, but today felt different. Today, something heavy sat in her chest, a premonition she couldn't quite shake. Elena paused, pressing her palm against the small of her back as she straightened. At 26, she already carried the weight of responsibilities that would crush most people her age. Every morning, she sent money to her mother Carmen in Queens, who struggled with diabetes and couldn't work anymore. Every evening, she helped her 17-year-old sister Maria with college applications, determined that at least one Rodriguez woman would break free from the cycle of service that had trapped generations of their family. The Blackwell Mansion was a testament to old money and new influence. Richard Blackwell had inherited a media empire from his father and expanded it into a conglomerate that touched everything from streaming services to sustainable technology. His wife, Victoria, had transformed their family image into a brand, their charity galas and environmental campaigns making headlines in society pages across the country. To the world, they were America's golden couple, philanthropists who cared about the planet and the less fortunate. Elena knew better. She had witnessed the shouting matches behind closed doors, seen Richard's shoulders sag under the weight of Victoria's constant demands for more publicity, more recognition, more proof that they were better than everyone else. She had watched their 8-year-old son Tommy retreat into himself, finding solace in his tablet and earbuds, while his parents performed their perfect family act for cameras and donors. "Elena!" Victoria's voice cut through the morning silence like a blade. Elena straightened immediately, her body responding to 3 years of conditioning. Victoria Blackwell appeared at the top of the spiral staircase, her platinum blonde hair already perfectly styled despite the early hour. She wore a cream-colored silk robe that probably cost more than Elena made in 6 months. "Yes, Mrs. Blackwell," Elena replied, her voice steady and respectful, though something inside her always recoiled when Victoria spoke to her like she was a piece of furniture that had disappointed her. "The Hartman Foundation Gala is tonight. I need you to work the event, not just prep." Maria called in sick conveniently. Victoria's laugh was sharp, humorless. "Honestly, you people and your excuses." Elena felt her jaw tighten. Maria wasn't one of you people. Maria was the other. Housekeeper, a 60-year-old woman from Ireland who had been with the family for 15 years and rarely took a sick day. But Elena had learned that defending herself or others only made things worse with Victoria. "Of course, Mrs. Blackwell. What time would you like me to arrive?" 7. "The event starts at 8, but I need you here early to handle last-minute details. And Elena..." Victoria paused dramatically, her manicured fingers gripping the banister. "Wear the black uniform tonight. The photographers will be everywhere. And I need staff who understand their place." The black uniform. Elena's stomach turned. Unlike the comfortable grey polo and slacks she wore for daily cleaning, the black uniform was a throwback to another era. A traditional maid's dress with a white apron, designed to make her invisible in all the ways that mattered, while simultaneously marking her as different from the guests who would fill these rooms tonight. "I understand," Elena said quietly. Victoria smiled, but it never reached her eyes. "Good. Oh, and make sure Tommy stays upstairs during the event. Children should be seen and not heard, especially during important gatherings." As Victoria glided away, her silk robe trailing behind her, Elena returned to her polishing with more force than necessary. The marble gleamed under her cloth, but she couldn't polish away the humiliation that coated everything in this house like dust. Later that afternoon, Elena sat in the staff break room, a small space tucked between the kitchen and the service entrance. She had called her mother during her lunch break, as she did every day, listening to Carmen's proud updates about Maria's latest acceptance letter and scholarship offers. "Mija, you sound tired," Carmen had said, her voice warm with concern that traveled through the phone like a hug. Are they treating you well? Elena had lied, as she always did. Everything's fine, Mama. Maria got into Columbia, didn't she? With that scholarship? Full ride. Can you believe it? Your sister is going. To be a lawyer, Elena. A real lawyer. The pride in her mother's voice made Elena's chest tight, with emotion. This was why she stayed. This was why she endured Victoria's cutting remarks and Richard's uncomfortable silences. Maria would have opportunities that Elena never did. Maria would sit at tables instead of serving them. Now, as evening approached, Elena stood in the mansion's service bathroom, staring at her reflection in the small mirror above the sink. The black uniform fit perfectly, tailored to her petite frame, but it felt like a costume for a play she never auditioned. For the white apron was crisp, starched to perfection, and the small white cap that completed the ensemble sat like a symbol of everything she was supposed to accept without question. She could hear the preparations beginning upstairs. Florists arranging, $10,000 centerpieces, caterers setting up their stations, musicians tuning instruments that cost more than most people's cars. The Hartman Foundation Gala was Victoria's pet project, an environmental charity that raised millions of dollars while attendees arrived in private jets and left in motorcades of luxury cars. Elena adjusted the cap one final time and walked toward the service elevator. As the doors closed, she caught a glimpse of herself in the polished metal. A young woman who looked like she belonged in a different century, trapped in a uniform that declared her worth before she ever opened her mouth. The elevator hummed, softly as it carried her upward, toward a night that would change everything she thought she knew about her place in the world. In a few hours, cameras would capture moments that would spread across social media like wildfire. But Elena didn't know that yet. She only knew that her chest felt tight with a familiar mixture of resignation and quiet rebellion. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped into a world transformed. The mansion's main floor had become a stage set for New York's elite, crystal chandeliers casting diamond patterns on walls lined with original artwork. Men in $1,000 tuxedos chatted with women wearing jewelry worth more than Elena's annual salary, their laughter floating above the gentle strings of a classical quartet. Elena took a deep breath and stepped forward, invisible in the way, Victoria intended, but more aware than any of these guests could imagine. She had learned to read people in this house, to understand the difference between public faces and private truths. Tonight, she would discover just how valuable that education had been. As she picked up a silver tray from the catering station, Elena noticed Tommy Blackwell sitting on the stairs leading to the second floor, his small face pressed between the banister rails. He held his tablet in his lap, earbuds dangling around his neck, watching the adult world with the serious expression of a child who had learned too much too early. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and Tommy raised his hand in a small wave. Elena smiled back, the first genuine expression she'd worn since putting on the uniform. In that moment, neither of them knew that by the end of the night, their lives would be forever intertwined in ways that would reshape not just their relationship, but the entire foundation of the world spinning around them in expensive shoes and borrowed elegance. The Hartman Foundation Gala was in full swing by 9 o'clock, the mansion's main floor pulsing with the energy of 300 of New York's most influential people. Elena moved through the crowd like a shadow, refilling champagne glasses and clearing empty appetizer plates, her presence acknowledged only when someone needed something from her silver tray. She had served at events like this before, but tonight felt different. The guests seemed more self-absorbed, more willing to treat her like furniture that happened to move. A real estate mogul snapped his fingers at her without looking up from his conversation about offshore investments. Her fashion designer grabbed a glass from her tray so roughly that champagne splashed onto Elena's white apron, then continued talking as if nothing had happened. Elena absorbed it all with the practiced grace she had developed over 3 years of service, but something was building inside her chest, a pressure that felt like a pot about to boil over. Victoria Blackwell held court near the mansion's grand piano, where a jazz trio played soft melodies that mixed with the tinkle of crystal and the murmur of important conversations. She wore a stunning emerald gown that had been featured in Vogue just last month, her jewelry catching the light every time she gestured to emphasize a point about environmental responsibility or social justice. The foundation has already planted over 50,000 trees this year, Victoria was saying to a circle of admirers that included 2 senators, a tech billionaire, and several Manhattan socialites. But of course, real change starts at home. It starts with how we treat the people in our immediate circle, how we model compassion and respect. Elena felt sick as she listened to Victoria's performance. This was the same woman who had screamed at the gardener last week for trimming a hedge incorrectly, the same woman who refused to let staff use the guest bathroom even during 12-hour shifts. As Elena approached with a fresh tray of canapes, Victoria's voice grew louder, more performative. She was aware of the phones pointed in her direction, the social media influencers capturing her every word for their millions of followers. "Take Elena here," Victoria said suddenly, reaching out to grab Elena's arm as she passed. Elena froze, her tray wobbling slightly in her hands. "Elena has been with our family for years and she's practically family herself, aren't you, dear?" Elena's throat went dry. Every eye in the circle was on her now, phones recording, society photographers snapping pictures. She could feel her face burning, but she managed to nod politely. "Yes, Mrs. Blackwell." Victoria's grip on her arm tightened, her perfectly manicured nails digging through the fabric of Elena's uniform. "Elena understands that in our household, we believe in treating everyone with dignity and respect. She's seen firsthand how we live our values, not just talk about them." The lies were so bold, so completely opposite to Elena's daily reality, that for a moment she couldn't speak. The circle of guests smiled benevolently, some nodding as if Victoria had just shared profound wisdom about social responsibility. "Tell them, Elena," Victoria continued, her voice honey-sweet, but her grip steel-tight. "Tell our friends how we've supported your family, how we've made sure you have everything you need." Elena opened her mouth, but before she could speak, Victoria continued her performance. "Of course, we had to teach Elena some basic etiquette when she first started with us. The importance of proper hygiene, appropriate behavior around our friends. These skills don't always come naturally to people from her background, but with patience and guidance." The words hit Elena like physical blows. Around the circle, she could see some guests looking uncomfortable, but none spoke up. Instead, phones continued recording, capturing Victoria's casual cruelty for social media content. Elena felt something snap inside her chest. 3 years of swallowed pride, 3 years of accepting insults for her family's sake, 3 years of watching Victoria perform compassion while practicing cruelty. But before she could find words, a small voice cut through the tension. "Mom, that's not true." Tommy Blackwell stood at the edge of the circle, still in his pajamas, despite being told to stay upstairs. His tablet was in his hand, and Elena realized with a chill that he had been recording. The 8-year-old looked directly at his mother, his young face serious and determined. "Elena taught me how to tie my shoes when you said you were too busy," Tommy continued, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "And she never makes fun of people. You do that." Victoria's face went white, then flushed deep red. "Tommy, go to your room immediately." "But Mom, you're being mean. Eleanor is nice to me. She's nicer than you are." The circle of guests shifted uncomfortably. Phones were still recording, but now they were capturing a very different story than Victoria had intended. Elena felt her heart breaking for Tommy, this little boy who was too young to understand the consequences of speaking truth in his mother's carefully constructed world. "Thomas Blackwell, if you don't go upstairs right now," Victoria's voice was dangerously quiet. But Tommy wasn't finished. He held up his tablet, his fingers moving across the screen. "I recorded you yesterday talking on the phone. You said you wanted to cause an accident to give someone a scare because they were being inconvenient. That's not nice either." The silence that followed was deafening. Elena could see Victoria's face cycling through emotions, rage, fear, calculation. Around them the party continued, but their little circle had become an island of tension in a sea of champagne and small talk. "You misunderstood what you heard," Victoria said finally, her voice strained. "Children often—" "I have it right." "Here," Tommy interrupted, holding up his tablet. "Want me to play it?" Victoria lunged forward, reaching for the tablet. "Give me that right now." Tommy stumbled backward, clutching the device to his chest. In his haste to get away from his mother's grasping hands, he stepped too close to the edge of the pool area, where the party had spilled out through open French doors onto the mansion's terrace. Eleanor saw it happening before anyone else. Tommy's heel caught on the raised threshold between the interior and the patio. His arms windmilled as he tried to regain his balance, the tablet flying from his hands and clattering across the marble. For a moment he teetered on the edge of the pool, his small body silhouetted against the underwater lights. Then he fell. The splash was loud enough to cut through the party noise, but it took several seconds for people to realize what had happened. Eleanor saw Tommy's small form disappear beneath the surface of the deep end, saw the bubbles rising where he had gone down. She looked around frantically. Victoria stood frozen, her hand still reaching for the tablet that was no longer there. The circle of guests stared at the pool with the kind of shocked immobility that comes when reality intrudes on performance. Someone was recording, of course. Someone was always recording, but no one was moving toward the water. Elena dropped her tray, the sound of breaking crystal lost in the growing commotion, and ran. She didn't think about her uniform, or her place, or the consequences. She thought only of Tommy, that serious little boy who had defended her when no one else would. She dove into the pool fully clothed, the shock of cold water driving the air from her lungs. The black uniform became heavy immediately, dragging at her limbs as she kicked downward. The underwater lights created strange patterns, and for a moment she couldn't see Tommy anywhere. Then she spotted him, sinking toward the bottom of the deep end, his small arms no longer struggling. Eleanor kicked harder, her lungs burning as she reached for him. Her fingers closed around his wrist and she pulled him against her chest, kicking desperately toward the surface. They broke through together, Eleanor gasping and coughing as she kept Tommy's head above water. He was conscious but coughing up pool water, his small hands clinging to her uniform. Eleanor looked toward the edge of the pool, expecting to see help approaching, expecting to see his parents rushing toward them. Instead, she saw phones, dozens of phones, recording their emergence from the water. The live stream of the gala had captured everything. Tommy's fall, the adults in action, Elena's rescue. She could see Victoria standing at the pool's edge now, but her expression was unreadable, calculating. Elena kicked toward the shallow end, her movements becoming sluggish as exhaustion and the weight of her sodden uniform took their toll. Tommy was getting heavier in her arms, or maybe she was getting weaker. The edge of the pool seemed to be getting farther away instead of closer. "Help!" she called out, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. Water lapped over her face and she realized she was sinking. The last thing Elena saw before her head went under was Richard Blackwell, Tommy's father, finally moving toward the pool with an expression of horror that had nothing to do with the cameras and everything to do with his son. She felt her head strike the pool's edge as she went down, a sharp pain that exploded into stars before everything went dark. When she came to, she was lying on the marble patio, water streaming from her clothes and hair. Tommy was beside her, wrapped in a towel, crying but breathing. Richard knelt next to both of them, his expensive tuxedo soaked from jumping in to pull them both out. "Elena, can you hear me?" His voice was gentle, concerned in a way she had never heard from him before. "The paramedics are coming. You hit your head, but you're going to be okay." Elena tried to sit up, but the world spun around her. Through the dizziness, she could see the crowd of guests standing in a semicircle around them, their phones still recording. She could see Victoria, in her emerald gown, standing apart from everyone else, her face a mask of fury and something else, something that looked like fear. "Tommy," Elena managed to whisper. "I'm okay," Tommy said, scrambling closer to her, despite his father's attempts to keep him wrapped in the towel. "You saved me, Elena. You saved me when nobody else would." Azay. Sirens wailed in the distance. Eleanor closed her eyes and let Richard's voice wash over her, as he spoke quietly to his son. But she could also hear the excited chatter of the guests, the rapid-fire clicking of phones as her rescue was uploaded to social media platforms around the world. She didn't know it yet, but in the next few hours, hashtags would begin trending. Elena the hero. Real charity starts at home. Where were the parents? The video of her diving into the pool while wealthy guests stood recording would be viewed millions of times by morning. Elena Rodriguez, the invisible domestic worker in the black uniform, was about to become the most visible person in America. And Victoria Blackwell, who had spent years crafting the perfect image, was about to discover that some performances can't survive the truth. Elena woke up in Mount Sinai Hospital to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly on the bedside table. The small room was filled with flowers, cards, and balloons from strangers, their colorful messages of support creating a stark contrast to the sterile white walls. Her head throbbed where she had struck the pool's edge, but the concussion was mild, the doctors had assured her. She would recover completely. What she wasn't prepared for was the world that awaited her outside the hospital walls. "You need to see this, Mija," her sister Maria said, holding up her phone with shaking hands. Elena's mother Carmen sat in the chair beside the bed, tears streaming down her weathered face as she watched the screen. The video was everywhere. Elena diving into the pool while elegantly dressed guests stood frozen with their phones. The contrast was stark and heartbreaking. A woman in a servant's uniform risking her life, while people worth millions of dollars documented the emergency instead of helping. The footage had been viewed over 50 million times in just 18 hours. But it wasn't just the rescue that had captured America's attention. Someone had leaked Tommy's audio recording from his tablet, the one where Victoria's voice could be clearly heard discussing causing an accident to send a message to someone who had become inconvenient. The context was vague, but combined with the footage of her standing motionless while her son nearly drowned, Victoria Blackwell had become the face of everything people despised about America's wealthy elite. Elena's phone hadn't stopped ringing since she'd regained consciousness. News producers, talk show hosts, book publishers, and movie studios all wanted a piece of her story. The offers were staggering, enough money to change her family's life forever, but something about the hungry desperation in their voices made her stomach turn. Elena Rodriguez represents the best of America, one news anchor was saying on the television mounted to the hospital wall. While the wealthy elite stood by recording on their phones, this brave young woman risked everything to save a child. She is the hero we need in these divided times. Elena reached for the remote and turned off the television. The praise felt as uncomfortable as Victoria's insults had, both reducing her to a symbol rather than treating her as a human being with complex motivations and feelings. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Richard Blackwell stood in the doorway, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. His expensive tuxedo wrinkled and stained with pool water. His eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and something deeper. "May I come in?" he asked, quietly. Elena nodded, though she noticed her mother's posture stiffen. Carmen had cleaned houses for 40 years before her diabetes forced her to retire, and she had learned to be wary of wealthy employers bearing gifts after controversies. Richard approached the bed slowly, as if afraid his presence might be unwelcome. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "and to apologize." "Thank me for what?" Elena asked, though she thought she knew. "For saving my son. For being the parent he needed when his actual parents failed him." Richard's voice cracked slightly. "I stood there, Elena. I stood there and watched him fall, and my first thought wasn't about saving Tommy. My first thought was about the cameras, about how this would look, about damage control." Elena had never heard Richard speak this honestly. In 3 years of working in his home, their conversations had been limited to polite exchanges about household logistics. She had always seen him as Victoria's shadow, successful but ultimately passive. "Where is Tommy now?" she asked. "With his nanny at my mother's house in Connecticut. He's asking for you constantly. He says you're his real mum now, and honestly—" Richard ran his hands through his disheveled hair. "I can't argue with him. Carmen leaned forward in her chair. "And where is your wife, Mr. Blackwell?" Richard's jaw tightened. "Victoria is with her lawyers. She's more concerned about managing her public image than she is about nearly losing her son." He turned back to Elena. "I want you to know that I've filed for separation. I've also contacted an independent auditing firm to review all our business, practices and charitable foundations. If there's corruption in my companies, I want it exposed." Elena studied his face, looking for signs of performance, the kind of calculated sincerity she had learned to recognize in this family. But Richard's exhaustion seemed genuine, his shame real. "I don't want your money, Mr. Blackwell," Elena said quietly, "or your guilt. I know that's what makes you different from everyone else in my world." Richard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. "But I do want to offer you something. My resignation from the board of the Hartman Foundation. I want you to take my place." Elena blinked in surprise. "I'm not qualified to—" "You're more qualified than anyone who's ever sat on that board," Richard interrupted. "You understand what it means to struggle, to make sacrifices for people you love. You understand the difference between charity that makes donors feel good and change that actually helps people." Before Elena could respond, another knock interrupted them. This time it was Tommy, who had apparently escaped his nanny's supervision and convinced his grandmother to drive him to the hospital. He still looked small and fragile, but his eyes lit up when he saw Elena. "Elena!" He rushed to her bedside and she opened her arms to embrace him. "Are you okay? Does your head hurt? I was so scared when you wouldn't wake up." "I'm fine, sweetheart," Elena said, smoothing his hair. "How are you feeling?" "Better now that I'm with you." Tommy climbed carefully onto the bed beside her. "Dad says you might not come back to work for us anymore." Elena looked at Richard over Tommy's head. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That his mother and I are separating, that we've treated you terribly, and that you have every right to find a family that deserves you." Tommy's grip on Elena's hand tightened. "But I need you. You're the only grown-up who listens to me. You're the only one who makes me feel safe." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. In 3 years of caring for this boy, she had watched him retreat further into himself as his parents' marriage crumbled, and their public personas became more important than their private relationships. She had seen him develop anxiety that no child should carry, learning to anticipate adult moods and navigate adult conflicts. "I'm not going anywhere, Tommy," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "But things are going to be different now." Over the next few days, as Elena recovered at home in her family's small apartment in Queens, she began to understand the magnitude of the attention focused on her. Reporters camped outside their building. Her mother couldn't go to the bodega without being followed by cameras. Maria had to take a leave of absence from her after-school job because journalists kept showing up at her workplace. But among the chaos, something beautiful began to emerge. Letters poured in from domestic workers across the country, sharing their own stories of mistreatment and invisible labor. Women wrote about employers who treated them as subhuman, about working without proper pay or benefits, about being afraid to speak up because they needed the jobs to support their families. Elena started reading every letter. She enlisted Maria's help to organize them, to look for patterns and common themes. What she discovered was a vast network of women who held American families together while being treated as disposable, interchangeable, invisible. That's when she got the call from Marcus Chen, an investigative journalist who worked independently. After leaving the Washington Post over editorial disagreements about corporate influence on journalism. "I've been following your story," Marcus said when they met at a small cafe in Astoria, far from the media circus surrounding Elena's apartment. "Thank you, Marcus, but I'm more interested in the story behind the story, the systemic issues that created the situation you found yourself in." Elena liked him immediately. Marcus didn't ask about her feelings or try to get her to cry on camera. Instead, he asked about wages, working conditions, legal protections, and the experiences of other domestic workers she knew. "I want to help," Elena told him, "but I don't want to become another media commodity. I want to do something that actually changes things." Marcus: nodded. What if we started small? What if we created a platform for domestic workers to share their stories anonymously? A place where they could connect with each other, share resources, maybe organize for better working conditions. It was during this conversation that Eleanor realized she had found her path forward. She wouldn't take the television deals or the book offers. She wouldn't become a celebrity survivor. Instead, she would use her unexpected platform to amplify voices that had been silenced for too long. Within a week, she and Marcus had launched the Invisible Workers Project, a website that collected stories from domestic workers and connected them with legal resources, support groups, and advocacy organizations. Eleanor's mother, despite her limited English, became the project's first volunteer coordinator, using her network of former domestic workers to spread the word through immigrant communities across New York. But Victoria Blackwell was not content to fade quietly into the background. As Eleanor was discovering her new purpose, Victoria was in the penthouse suite of her lawyer's office, plotting her comeback. "She's made me a laughingstock," Victoria said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "A maid, a nobody from Queens, has destroyed everything I've built." Her lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Patricia Holbrook, spread documents across the mahogany conference table. "We need to be careful here, Victoria. The public sympathy is entirely with Elena Rodriguez right now. Any move against her has to be subtle." Victoria picked up one of the documents, a background check on Elena that went back 3 generations. "Everyone has secrets, Patricia. Everyone has something they're ashamed of. Elena Rodriguez appears to be remarkably clean. No criminal record, no debt problems, no questionable associations." Victoria's smile was cold. "Then we'll create some." She had already started making calls. Former employees who had been fired from the Blackwell household for various infractions suddenly found themselves contacted by private investigators asking about Elena's behavior. Her few were offered substantial payments for statements about her suspicious activities or inappropriate conduct. But Victoria's masterstroke was reaching out to Sarah Chen, Marcus's ex-wife and Richard's former lover from a brief affair 5 years earlier. Sarah was a struggling artist who had never gotten over the humiliation of being publicly exposed when the affair came to light. She had been living in Los Angeles, barely making ends meet, when Victoria's representative approached her with an offer too tempting to refuse. "All you have to do is tell people what you remember about Richard's relationship with his staff," the representative had said. How he had inappropriate relationships with multiple employees, how there might have been a pattern of exploitation. Sarah had initially resisted. She knew Elena's story, had watched the viral video like everyone else. But Victoria's people were persuasive, and the money they offered would solve Sarah's financial problems permanently. As Elena worked to build something positive from her traumatic experience, forces were aligning against her that she couldn't see coming. Victoria had learned from her public failure at the gala. This time, her attack would be methodical, insidious, and designed to destroy Elena's credibility piece by piece. The war for Elena Rodriguez's reputation was about to begin, and she had no idea that her greatest enemy was planning an assault that would test not just her resolve, but her faith in the possibility of truth and justice in a world where money could buy almost any narrative. Meanwhile, Tommy Blackwell sat in his grandmother's house in Connecticut, creating a video on his tablet. It was a simple message, recorded in his 8-year-old voice, explaining to the world why Elena Rodriguez was his real hero and how she had shown him what it meant to be truly brave. He didn't know that his innocent testimony would soon become a crucial piece of evidence in a much larger battle, or that his words would help determine whether truth could triumph over wealth and influence. The video was titled, "Why Elena Is My Real Mom," and when Tommy's grandmother found it and posted it to her small social media account, it would reach Elena just as Victoria's first attack was beginning to unfold. 6 months after the gala that changed everything, Elena stood in the offices of the newly restructured Blackwell Foundation, looking out over Central Park as autumn painted the trees in shades of gold and crimson. The independent audit had been completed, revealing years of financial irregularities and questionable charitable practices under Victoria's leadership. Richard had kept his word, implementing transparency measures that turned his media empire into a model of corporate responsibility. But Elena's peaceful morning was shattered when Marcus Chen burst through her office door, his face grim with concern. "Victoria's making her move," he said, spreading printouts of news articles across Elena's desk. "Look at this." The headlines were devastating. Blackwell employee accused of financial manipulation. Questions raised about hero housekeeper's past. Former Blackwell staff members claim pattern of inappropriate behavior. Eleanor felt sick as she read the articles. Former employees she barely remembered were quoted extensively, claiming she had stolen items from the house, that she had been involved in financial schemes, that she had engaged in inappropriate relationships with Richard while still married to Victoria. "These are lies," Elena whispered, but even as she said it, she could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. In the digital age, accusations traveled faster than truth. "I know they're lies," Marcus said, "but Victoria's gotten smart. She's hired the best crisis management firm money can buy. They've created fake documents, coached witnesses, and timed everything to coincide with your biggest success." Eleanor had just been appointed to the board of 3 major charitable foundations. The Invisible Workers Project had expanded to cover domestic workers in 12 states. Her relationship with Richard had deepened into something real and beautiful, built on shared values and mutual respect rather than power dynamics. Now, all of that was under attack. "There's more," Marcus continued reluctantly. "Richard's ex-lover, Sarah Chen, has come forward. She's claiming that Richard has a pattern of exploiting female employees and that your relationship with him follows the same pattern as their affair." Eleanor sank into her chair. Sarah Chen's name was familiar from whispered conversations she had overheard during her time as a housekeeper. The affair had happened years before Elena started working for the family, but its discovery had nearly destroyed Richard's marriage at the time. "She's scheduled to appear on Good Morning America tomorrow," Marcus said. "Victoria's people have set up a whole media blitz. By next week, you'll be portrayed as either a gold-digging opportunist or a naive victim of a serial predator. Either way, your credibility is destroyed." Eleanor closed her eyes, trying to process the magnitude of Victoria's revenge. It was brilliant in its cruelty, using Eleanor's own success against her. The higher her profile, the further she would fall when these accusations took hold. "There has to be something we can do," Elena said. "Some way to prove these allegations are false." Marcus nodded grimly. "I'm already working on it, but we need to move fast, and we need Sarah Chen to tell the truth about who approached her and what she was offered." That evening, Elena sat in Richard's apartment overlooking the Hudson River, watching Tommy work on his homework at the dining table. The 8-year-old had been living with his father full-time since the separation, and the change in him was remarkable. The anxious, withdrawn child Elena had known was becoming confident and curious, asking questions about everything from his math problems to why adults sometimes lied. "Elena looks sad," Tommy observed, looking up from his worksheets. "Is Mom being mean again?" Richard and Elena exchanged glances. They had tried to shield Tommy from the worst of Victoria's behavior, but children notice more than adults realize. "Your mom is having a hard time accepting that things have changed," Elena said carefully. "Sometimes when people are hurt, they try to hurt others back." Tommy considered this seriously. "That's not okay, though. When I'm mad at someone, you teach me to use words, not to be mean back." "You're right, sweetheart. That's exactly right." As Tommy returned to his homework, Richard moved to sit beside Elena on the couch. "We can fight this," he said quietly. "I have resources, connections. I can hire the best legal team in the country." Elena shook her head. "That's exactly what Victoria expects. She wants this to become a battle between rich people using lawyers and public relations firms as weapons. If we fight fire with fire, we become like her." "Then what do you suggest?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, thinking about all the letters she had received from domestic workers around the country. Women who had been silenced by fear, by economic vulnerability, by a system that treated their word as worthless compared to their employer's money. "We tell the truth," she said. "Finally, all of it, not just the parts that make us look good." The next morning, while Sarah Chen was sitting in the green room at Good Morning America, preparing to destroy Elena's reputation on national television, she received an unexpected visitor. Elena Rodriguez walked in alone, having convinced the security guard that she was a friend. She looked nothing like the victim Sarah had been expecting to encounter. For instead of defeat or desperation, Elena radiated a calm strength that made Sarah suddenly uncomfortable with her prepared testimony. "I wanted to meet you before you went on air," Elena said, taking the seat across from Sarah. "I wanted to look you in the eye and ask you why you're doing this." Sarah's carefully rehearsed talking points evaporated. She had expected Elena to be either confrontational or pleading. This quiet directness was disarming. "I don't know what you mean," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Victoria's people offered you money to say things about Richard and me that aren't true. I understand why you'd be tempted. I understand what it's like to need money so badly that you'd consider doing something that goes against your values." Sarah felt tears building behind her eyes. "You don't understand anything about my life." "I understand more than you think. I know what it's like to work 3 jobs and still not have enough to pay rent. I know what it's like to have someone with money and power treat you like you don't matter. I know what it's like to be so desperate that bad choices start looking reasonable." Sarah stared at Elena, seeing something she hadn't expected. Genuine compassion for the woman who was supposed to be her victim. "They told me you were just another gold digger," Sarah whispered. "They said you were using Richard the same way he used me." "And what do you think now that you've met me?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying Elena's face. "I think I've made a terrible mistake." 20 minutes later, Sarah Chen walked onto the Good Morning America set, but instead of delivering the character assassination Victoria had paid for, she told the truth. She explained how Victoria's representatives had approached her, what they had offered her, and how they had coached her testimony. She admitted that her relationship with Richard had been consensual, that she had never seen him engage in inappropriate behavior with staff, and that she had allowed her personal hurt to be manipulated into a weapon against an innocent person. The interview ended Victoria's carefully orchestrated media campaign before it could fully begin. By noon, investigative reporters had obtained financial records showing payments from Victoria's accounts to Sarah and several former Blackwell employees. The falsified documents were exposed through digital forensics that revealed they had been created weeks after their supposed dates. But Victoria wasn't finished. If she couldn't destroy Elena through character assassination, she would confront her directly. The confrontation came on what should have been the happiest day of Elena's life. She and Richard had decided to marry in a small ceremony at the IT Blackwell Foundation offices, transforming their personal commitment into a symbol of the Foundation's new mission. Instead of an extravagant society wedding, they planned to use the event to launch a new program supporting domestic workers' rights. Elena stood in the Foundation's main conference room, which had been decorated simply with flowers donated by local immigrant communities. Her dress was elegant but modest, purchased with her own money rather than accepting Richard's offer to buy her something expensive. Her mother and sister sat in the front row, tears of joy streaming down their faces. Tommy, acting as ring-bearer, fidgeted with excitement in his small navy suit. The ceremony was being live-streamed to raise awareness for domestic workers' rights, with viewers encouraged to donate to advocacy organizations. It was the opposite of everything Victoria had represented, authentic rather than performative, focused on service rather than status. That's when Victoria Blackwell burst through the doors. She wore a pristine white suit, her blonde hair perfectly styled, carrying a briefcase full of documents. Behind her came a small army of private investigators and lawyers, along with a documentary crew she had hired to capture what she intended to be Elena's final humiliation. "Stop this farce immediately," Victoria announced, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "This woman is a fraud, and I have proof." Richard stepped protectively in front of Elena, but she gently moved him aside. She had been expecting this moment ever since the media attacks began. "What proof is that, Victoria?" Eleanor asked calmly. Victoria opened her briefcase with theatrical flair, pulling out folders of documents. "Financial records showing you've been embezzling from the foundation. Testimony from multiple witnesses about your inappropriate relationship with my husband while you were in my employ. Evidence that you orchestrated the entire pool incident to gain sympathy and advance your position." The room buzzed with shocked whispers, but Elena remained calm. She had learned something important from Victoria's earlier attacks. The truth was more powerful than any performance. "May I see those documents?" Marcus Chen asked, stepping forward. He had been live-streaming the entire confrontation, and millions of viewers were watching Victoria's accusations in real time. Victoria handed over the papers with confidence, but her expression began to change as Marcus examined them with the eye of an experienced investigative journalist. "These financial records," Marcus said, holding up a document, "they're dated last month, but they claim to show transactions from 6 months ago. The font is Calibri, but the Blackwell Foundation uses Times New Roman for all official documents. The digital signature doesn't match any in the Foundation's authentication system." He moved to the next set of papers. "These witness statements all use identical phrasing in key sections, same grammatical errors, same unusual word choices. They weren't written by different people. They were written by the same person, trying to sound like different voices." Victoria's confidence began to crack, but she pressed on. "The pool incident is documented from 17 different angles." Tommy Blackwell interrupted, stepping forward with his tablet. The 8-year-old had been quiet during the confrontation, but now he looked directly at his mother with a seriousness beyond his years. "I have all the original files. Want me to play them?" Victoria stared at her son, realizing that her final gambit had failed. The documents she had paid thousands of dollars to create were being debunked in real time, broadcast live to an audience that was growing by the minute as news of the confrontation spread across social media. But it was Elena's response that truly ended Victoria's war of revenge. "I forgive you," Elena said simply. The room went silent. Victoria stared at her former employee, the woman she had tried so hard to destroy, unable to process what she had just heard. "I know you're in pain," Elena continued. "I know you feel like your world has been taken away from you. I know what it's like to feel powerless, but this isn't who you really are, Victoria. This is who your hurt has made you become." Victoria's carefully constructed facade cracked completely. For the first time in months, her public mask slipped, revealing the frightened, desperate woman underneath. She sank into one of the conference room chairs, her briefcase of false evidence forgotten on the floor. "You don't understand," Victoria whispered. "I've lost everything. My reputation, my marriage, my position. I'm nothing without those things." "You're wrong," Elena said, kneeling beside Victoria's chair. "You're Tommy's mother. You're a person with intelligence and creativity and the capacity to help others. You've just forgotten how to see past your fear." The confrontation that Victoria had intended as Elena's destruction became instead a moment of unexpected grace, witnessed by millions of viewers who had tuned in expecting scandal, but found something much more powerful. The wedding ceremony continued after Victoria left quietly with her lawyers and investigators. Elena and Richard exchanged vows that emphasized partnership rather than possession, service rather than status. They promised to use their combined resources and platform to amplify voices that had been silenced and to create opportunities for people who had been overlooked. But the story's most important transformation was still to come. Victoria Blackwell was eventually charged with fraud, witness tampering, and several other crimes related to her campaign against Eleanor. During her trial, the extent of her corruption was fully revealed. She was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison, but what happened during those 3 years surprised everyone who knew her. In prison, Victoria met women from backgrounds similar to Elena's, women who had worked multiple jobs to support their families, who had been discarded by the system when they made mistakes, who had learned to survive through intelligence and determination rather than privilege and connections. For the first time in her life, Victoria was forced to see the world from the perspective of people she had always dismissed as invisible. She began tutoring women in basic literacy and financial planning. She organized support groups for mothers, separated from their children. She learned that the skills she had used to manipulate media and public opinion could be redirected toward advocacy for prison reform and support for incarcerated women. When Victoria was released, she faced a world that had largely forgotten her. Her Upper East Side social circle had moved on. Her business connections had evaporated. She found herself living in a modest apartment in Queens, working for a non-profit organization that helped formerly incarcerated women reintegrate into society. Elena learned about Victoria's new life through their work with overlapping advocacy organizations. When she heard that Victoria was struggling to find stable housing due to her criminal record, Elena did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She hired Victoria. Not as a gesture of charity or public relations, but because Victoria had developed genuine skills in organizing and advocacy during her time in prison. The Invisible Workers Project had grown into a national movement, and they needed someone who understood both the challenges faced by marginalized women and the media landscape that could amplify their voices. The reunion between Eleanor and Victoria happened in the hallway of a community center in Brooklyn, where both women were attending a meeting about domestic workers' rights. They saw each other across the crowded corridor, two women whose lives had been forever intertwined by conflict and transformation. "Elena," Victoria said quietly, her voice carrying none of the imperious tone that had once defined her. "I owe you an apology, not just for what I did after the gala, but for every day I treated you as less than human when you worked in my home." Elena studied Victoria's face, seeing genuine remorse rather than calculated performance. "Apologies are a good start," she said, "but what matters more is what we do moving forward. I'd like to help if you'll let me. I know I can't undo the harm I've caused, but maybe I can use what I've learned to prevent others from making the same mistakes." And so Victoria Blackwell, who had once embodied the worst aspects of wealth and privilege, became an unlikely advocate for the women she had spent years dismissing. She started small, working as a volunteer coordinator for events and gradually proving her commitment through consistent action rather than grand gestures. 5 years after the gala that changed everything, Elena Rodriguez stood at the podium of the United Nations headquarters in New York, addressing a global conference on domestic workers' rights. She was now the director of the International Invisible Workers Coalition, an organization that had helped improve working conditions for millions of domestic workers across 6 continents. In the audience, she could see her family, her mother Carmen, now healthy and proud, her sister Maria, who had graduated from Columbia Law School and worked as a civil rights attorney, Tommy Blackwell, now 13 and passionate about documentary filmmaking, and Richard, whose media empire had become a platform for investigative journalism and social advocacy. Also in the audience, in a section reserved for coalition volunteers, sat Victoria Blackwell. She wore a simple blue dress instead of designer gowns. Her hair was shorter and streaked with natural gray, and her hands bore the calluses of someone who had learned the value of physical work. She applauded as Elena spoke about the dignity of labor and the importance of seeing every person as worthy of respect and opportunity. After Elena's speech, the two women found themselves standing together on the UN building's observation deck, looking out over the East River as the sun set behind Manhattan's skyline. "Do you ever think about that night?" Victoria asked. "About how different things could have been if I had just treated you with basic human decency from the beginning?" Elena considered the question seriously. "I think about it differently now. If you had been kind to me, I might never have found my voice. I might never have realized that I had the power to stand up for myself and others. Sometimes the worst experiences teach us the most important lessons." Victoria nodded slowly. "I've learned that being broken can be a gift if you let it teach you empathy instead of bitterness. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the city lights begin to twinkle in the growing darkness. "The children at the center ask me about you sometimes," Victoria said. She now managed an after-school program for children of domestic workers, many of whom were in situations similar to where Tommy had been years earlier. "They want to know if it's really possible for people to change as much as we both have." "What? Do you tell them?" "I tell them that change is possible, but it's not magic. It requires recognizing the truth about yourself, accepting responsibility for harm you've caused, and then doing the hard work of becoming someone different." Every single day. As they prepared to leave, Elena turned to Victoria one last time. "There's something I've never told you. That night at the gala when I dove into the pool to save Tommy, I wasn't thinking about being a hero or making a statement. I was thinking about what my mother taught me when I was little." "What was that?" "She said that when you see someone drowning, you don't stop to ask if they deserve to be saved. You just save them because that's what human beings do for each other." Victoria felt tears fill her eyes. "Thank you for saving all of us." Elena smiled. "We saved each other." End of the story. Dear listeners, we hope Elena and Victoria's journey has touched something deep in your hearts. This story shows us that no matter how far we fall, no matter how much we've hurt others or been hurt ourselves, transformation is always possible when we choose truth over performance, service over status, and compassion over revenge. If this story moved you, we invite you to share it with someone who needs to hear that second chances are real, that dignity belongs to every person regardless of their job or background, and that the most powerful changes often begin with the smallest acts of courage. Leave us a comment telling us about a time when someone showed you unexpected kindness, or when you chose to extend grace to someone who had wronged you. Every day we bring you stories like this one that reveal the extraordinary courage hidden in ordinary moments, the profound strength that emerges from our deepest struggles, and the beautiful truth that we all have the power to change not just our own lives, but the lives of everyone around us. Subscribe to our channel, share your own stories of transformation, and join us tomorrow for another journey into the resilient, magnificent, complicated heart of